Hello, thank you very much for having me here today. I want to talk about my current projects, which has been about den building in care homes and looking at creativity and play in later life. I just wanted to welcome you to the den that I've created for the presentation today. So hopefully we're all in our digital den together. So before I talk about work, I just wanted to introduce myself. So hello, I'm Stacey Coughlin. I'm a visual artist and I've also been an arts wellbeing practitioner in lots of different settings and with lots of different groups of people. I am based in Burnley and I've worked in Greater Manchester and Lancashire for around 20 years and looking at arts-based practices and creativity to enhance people's well-being. I'm also a qualified counsellor and I've used these skills together as an emotional wellbeing practitioner. Before I talk about the work, I just wanted to talk a little bit about where it might have come from. So working with people living in care homes with memory impairments, cognitive impairments and physical impairments, the very usual typical place that you might end up working is in these pictures here. So you might be familiar with them, but these are different forms of dining room settings and places where activity takes place. And predominantly it has been in the dining room. And while this is a great space because there's lots of tables to do lots of activity, product-based arts and crafts, it's a good place to sit people round. I questioned whether is it the most accessible place, sort of, if people might have cognitive or memory impairments, that ability to frame switch in such settings. So for instance, if you live in a care home and you're going to the dining room, you might be expected it to be a meal time, that you're going to get food. So if you're past a pencil or a paintbrush, there might be that initial resistance to being creative. And so from this work, I was interested in how we look at that sort of first engagement with people and how that response is altered or looked at differently, just being in the environment, or how the environment changes that sort of engagement really. And so I wanted to look at the care home environment. So this is a photograph I took in a care home a little while ago, but just sort of looking at how Hilary Moss's idea of aesthetic deprivation, which was looking at sort of hospital settings, but it can be around whole different forms of institutions where that idea about aesthetic consideration might not be a priority, or it might be looking at personalization might be difficult in such spaces like that. And so it's kind of looking at those elements and recognizing that those are kind of difficulties that might be present in those sorts of environments. And so this led me to the Travelling Art Tent, which is a mobile pop-up gallery space that has lots of multisensory elements to it. It has lots of artwork that was created. The space was designed by the residents and used as a place to come together and experience music and artwork and lots of lovely sort of elements of the space together. So this was created as a sociopital space where it kind of brings people together and look at new ways of looking at relationships and the space itself. It is something that's quite extraordinary. It's something that alters the space that somebody might be quite familiar with. They might have lived in that space for quite a number of years, but it was to provide something different and unusual and carnivalesque in that space that was temporary but provided a new frame of reference for that moment. And so from that project that was working with 3 care homes and a day centre, it was creating the artwork to then be placed within that space. And I was interested in 3 different areas that kind of informed that kind of project and that artwork. The first one is looking at arts wellbeing as a practice, so recognising it as a visual arts, but situating it within an arts wellbeing practice, and looking how creativity can inform our wellbeing and also improve our quality of life. and looking at that as a form of practice. I was also interested in looking at the idea of identity and how art and creativity can inform our sense of identity, and our need to express and explore identity remains with us throughout our life. And so it can be looking at people living in care homes. There's been research about how identity can be explored and expressed. So, for instance, through fashion, or Buse and Twigs looks at the idea of handbags and what they might be kept in handbags. Jenno looked at meal times and those kinds of ideas around how identity can be reaffirmed through the environment, or what kind of visual stimulus or activities that take place there. And then looking at the care home environment and recognising it's quite a unique setting, first in terms of it having to be quite multi-use, in that it does have to be a home for people that live there. It's also a place of work for the workers, that sort of carers that care for people. And also there is a lot of legislative and regulatory necessary needs that have to be taken into consideration as an organisation, such as CQC and the NHS and other forms of nursing care that has to promote and adhere to. So it has to be lots of different things for lots of different people in the same space. And you might be working with limited space in terms of what people have. It's also recognising the potential for Goffman's idea of total institutions, where it can become an institutionalized setting, in that people might not have the same opportunities to express their identity. For instance, they might not have their familiar chair or can sit in the same place, or they don't have potentially a say over what wallpaper is put on the walls, or what curtains are, or what colours are around, or what ornaments are visible. Whereas people might have had those experiences earlier on in their life and less so in a care home setting. So it's recognising how design, particularly looking at environmental design and design for dementia and other sort of elements of care home design, can affect people's behaviour and attitudes and sort of social interactions, really. And so from this, recognising the individual's experience is quite paramount to all of these different forms of research, really. So looking at people's life world and experience and lived experience, and how that informs all this work. So the important element is the individual's sort of experience and experience of the creativity. So looking at all of these sort of research elements, I just want to recognise the difficulty and the duality of language. So on here I have sort of these two very contentious words of art with a capital A and play. And so a lot of the work that I do is quite playful and is artistic, but recognising that those two words hold a complete different sets of values for different people. And it might be that some people that might not have a lot of confidence in their creative abilities, that might be living in care homes, might not have a lot of association with those words, or might find them challenging. And so it's recognising that us as practitioners, or as academics, or lots of different people might have those different words. And here we're talking about sort of process and flow and aesthetic experience, and looking at everyday participation, and all those other sort of forms of sort of academic research are really relevant, but they might be difficult to sort of explain or take part within an actual session. So just recognising those kind of difficulties of how we respond to language, and it might be that it's finding that sort of nice sort of grey area in the middle that kind of can use that language, or it can be finding a common language with the people that we work with. So when I was grappling with these kind of issues around sort of what the travelling art tent might have been, and also kind of what those languages were as well, I was led to the idea of den making, and I felt den making was a really good structure in which to put all of these ideas in, as it was something that was quite universal and something that kind of can be understood as again looking at that sort of initial interaction in the dining room, essentially. So dens and identity. So looking at how dens are are quite universal. They've found through all different cultures around the world. There might be forts, Wendy houses, dens, lots of different words for some form of space that kind of is associated with childhood play, that is created temporarily through all sorts of different structures, but can inform our sense of identity and our sense of what place may be for us. And really there's elements of how the self can be translated into a spatial representation, how identities can be informed through spaces, but also how these sort of very time-based elements can have elements of negotiation between different parties, between different children. There might be idea of role modelling, there might be different elements of role play that can be informed within these sort of den structures. So there's lots of different research, Sobel, Coughlin, there's lots of different research around how dens have informed childhood play. And so this led me to exploring different forms of dens in my creative practice, so kind of looking at created spaces and deconstructed them into sort of their different elements. And this led me to the current project I've been working on, which was funded by the Arts Council England as a Developing Your Creative Practice fund. And this was looking at developing this process, but it was also leading up to working with people on a one-to-one basis to create their own bespoke den, looking at their own forms of identity. And this was particularly important after working in a lot of group work within sort of dining rooms. I really wanted to kind of bring that focus into that individual's experience and providing that unique opportunity to create their own space, to be in there for that temporary moment in a care home. So looking at sort of how that creative engagement process came about. So it was kind of developing 4 key sort of elements to that den formation, if you like. And the first one was kind of creating that space. So the creative space making was physically creating the space, which could have been either partially built, I could have built it, or they could have given me instructions on how to build it, but it was creating the space overall. And then there is some form of story. There's a beginning, a middle and an end to our story of how we interact with the den, and more importantly how we have an ending. So we keep kind of a script, if you like, and we kind of write these down, which is quite useful if people might have a little difficulty sort of remembering what we talked about. So we have a script and thinking about when it is time to leave the space as an ending. There's also some form of activity. This could be a creative activity. We might create something within the space that then becomes a totem of the space we've created that can then be taken away as a remembrance, as a memory of that space. Or it could be about looking at images. It could be about lots of different forms of activity. And then there might be some form of persona. So it could be quite a very definite role play. It could be somebody might want to be completely different in that space, or it might be looking at just being mindful in terms of like you are something else within that space. You might not just be a resident in a care home. You might be another form of your identity. You might be your younger self in that space, talking about reminiscing. Or it could be just different forms of frame switching within that space. And so these 4 elements were created together to then create temporary spaces with the residents. So looking at how this co-creation design process came about, and looking at this, these are some images of the current project that I've just been working on. So this is the space that we were working in. It was a sort of a nice conservatory area, which was just away from other seating areas, so it was nice and contained and away from people if they thought it was too much. We did a little bit of rapport building, and we did some creative elements such as painting and drawing, some collaging, some sand art, some different ways of things that people might be familiar with in terms of product-based arts. From that, we then looked at designing and just reminiscing and talking about different spaces, and this was kind of done through providing objects. Then from that we did some designing of spaces, so we looked at maquette making. There was also some elements of chance in there, so if people were struggling to come up with ideas, we just threw some dice that had different elements that might have been a form of a role or where we were going or what we were doing there, and then that was kind of looked around in terms of, again, looking at a form of script. We then created spaces, so these spaces might have been based on particular places we talked about or particular stories. And then there were elements that we kind of created within the spaces to add to them as forms of adding to the overall space. So the dens were created with fabrics and lights. We had a projector in there, and then we created our own elements within there as well. We also had some we had some orange juice there with some ice cream. We're on the beach, so it kind of added some other different sort of sensory environments, elements in there as well. And then creating, as I say, different fabrics and elements that kind of came together. And this was all different, unique spaces for each individual person. So from this work, I came up with 8 elements of kind of like design principles that were kind of key components to this overall process, if you like. And for the purpose of this, I don't have time to go through them all really, but I'm just going to kind of concentrate on a couple of them. The first one is, again, looking at the invitation. So as I talked about in that dining room, those initial interactions and first impressions and how they are important and guide how people interact or engage with creative activities. There might be the element of what value the creative engagement is to different people, and also looking at their role within this as well. So for some of this, I asked for help. I asked people to be helpers, if they could help me with this project I was doing. And this was an interesting way of kind of sort of having this sort of initial interaction, because they were needed, they were valued as some form of helper, as a co-collaborator, as a co-producer, but also as a helper. And it was quite interesting sort of way of an invitation for some people that kind of worked quite well. This discussion came through the travelling briefcase, which is a series of sculptures that I created as interactive elements that are based on different spaces, everyday spaces that people might be familiar with. And they were totems to look at, to spark conversation and to spark engagement about different spaces, to help them come up with ideas themselves that might be places they might want to create a den about. Another element of this is kind of looking at creating a space for a place. So I was interested in the den being a space in which a place could be created in a temporary element, but in a temporary moment, but also looking at that kind of spatial context, if you like. So here there's lots of different forms of space that we can look at in terms of the physical space and the sensorial space, but also looking at those kind of social and interpersonal spaces that we talk about. Harnett refers to the idea of respite spaces being created in care homes through frames of reference, shared frames of reference with people, creating these mini moments that can be sort of shared with people. And I was quite interested in those time-based sort of spaces within that, and kind of looking at the becoming of place through these elements. And also recognising that we are spatial beings. So referring back to hermeneutic phenomenology and Heidegger, who kind of recognising that we exist in space. One of our common experiences between us all is that we are spatial beings, and that space permeates our existence so much. It is through all our explanations of our emotions and our experiences, yet it's something that can be hidden in plain sight because it is so part of our everyday existence. It's something that we perhaps take for granted. And so here we have sort of who we are is defined by where we are, and recognizing how space can have such a significant influence on who we are as a person and how our identity is formed, and how we can convey that identity or convey it through activity through different spaces that we are in. And so looking at that, how our identity is kind of therefore placial. So our identity is informed through the places that we are. So Bachelard talks about the exploration of self identity through place in the different forms and the different elements of place. Another element was kind of talking about dialogue. So recognizing the physical aspect of the den making as being a space physically, but also creating spaces through dialogue. So we talked about there about negotiation and sort of those elements of creation that are through language, but also looking at that shared meaning making through the discussions between myself and the residents, and how space can be created through those, similar to the respite spaces that we talked about just then. So this led me to the concept of a placial dialogue, where the creation of place through conversation and a shared understanding of language, whether that can be visual, verbal and non-verbal. So this is kind of a form of placemaking and storytelling, but how place can be created through dialogue and through a shared commonality, really, that and the shared frame of reference. And just finally looking at interaction, so how interaction can inform the ways that we work with people as sort of like a familiar interactions, and how that can inform how we work in the den. And there's also sort of elements there about situational framing there. So Gordon talks about how frame switching allows multiple interpretations of the same time. So how people living with dementia can interact with each other in the moment through that shared frame of understanding. And finally here, there's just some of our interactions that we did. So there were quite some sensory elements, there were some creative elements here, and kind of creating them all together. So we did do some group work in the dens as well, which was an experience to sort of bring them together in the space as well. And just want to say thank you very much for listening. Yeah, thank you. If you've got any questions, please let me know.